Apparently when recording is on, we have this consent automatically that people are going to see and to agree that they are going to be recorded or participate in the session that is being recorded. Lovely seeing you. Great.
Good morning, everybody.
Hello, Shane. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Good evening. Good evening.
Alan, how are you?
Hi, good. Yeah, good. You recovered from COVID?
Not COVID. I tested negative. I got something else.
Oh, okay. All right.
Probably the next thing that's going to come and get everybody.
Right. Okay. But you recovered at least. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's the most important thing, Shane. No, really. So.
No, thank you. I'm feeling much better. Much appreciated. Everyone's had so much love out there. I appreciate that.
Isn't it nice, right? That's this collective effort when everybody starts to wish you best health, and you immediately start to feel better.
Indeed, absolutely.
That's kind of an idea behind.
Yes.
Sorry, Alan. I mean, the sound is.
You're from South Africa?
Yes, I am.
Right?
Correct. Yes, I am.
Okay. So I'm going to feel pretty fraudulent telling you about South Africa, given that I've never been. I'll just do a little bit on the history, that's all, and then hand over to you. Okay.
You know, it's interesting. Like all things, when you teach, you learn yourself. I learned a lot doing this little assignment. It was wonderful, actually, very reminiscent, and I dug into a couple of key little tidbits that I hadn't touched on before. So I really enjoyed this, Doctor.
Thank you, Shane. So that's exactly an idea, Alan. We need your expertise in history, in understanding of all these historical events. And we have Shane's lived experiences. So
absolutely,
and plus some research, right, Shane, that you have undertaken. And just I hope that should be a combination, quite interesting. And plus, again, I would like just to emphasize that the format of this meeting is this round table, right? So nobody claims that he or she is an absolute expert, keynote speaker, right? So that's kind of the thing, the debating, having this discussion on the matters which are important and interesting to discuss.
I mean, I'm a chemist and a biochemist and a microbiologist. So when I'm talking economics, I think I can get away with more than my expertise seems to allow.
Okay.
That's right. That's lifelong learning, right, Shane? So
Absolutely.
that's why we are here, all of us.
We always say back in South Africa, a BSc degree. BSc stands for behind the shop counter. It's experience, right?
That's right. That's right. No, absolutely.
Very good.
Professor Tree, lovely to see you. That's great that the traffic wasn't that bad.
Yeah. Finally, I just back about 30 minutes ago.
Okay, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Martin, lovely to see you. Well, welcome. Hi to London. Yes, Hasrov, lovely to see you. Hasrov is joining from Azerbaijan, from Baku. Hasrov, do you believe that more people are going to join us from Azerbaijan? I hope so, right? I can't see them yet, but that should be great. We have Sean joining from California, from the United States of America. Hi, Sean.
Morning, guys.
So that's an absolutely kind of wonderful, coverage, geographical. And Pilot, lovely to see you. Pilot, remind me, what is the country that you're in?
I'm from Zimbabwe, Professor.
Okay, that's right.
I'm from Zimbabwe, Harare, Zimbabwe. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone.
Yes, and Pilot mentioned that actually Zimbabwe and South Africa are trading partners. So we hope to hear something really interesting from Pilot as well. And from Adebisi, I can't see you, but I'm sure that you must be somewhere here. Adebisi?
Yeah, I'm here, Prof. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, that's lovely to see you. Won't believe it. Oh yeah, Adebisi, you're just right next to me.
Yeah.
I've been looking at somewhere. Okay, brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, thank you for joining us today on Sunday. This Sunday colloquiums conducted or held under the umbrella of Research Institute of UBIS, and I'm the director of Research Institute. And really, really thank you and welcome.
So I hope that today, when you joined the session, you saw the notification that the recording is on and the session is going to be recorded. So as soon as you're with us, you logged in, connected, it means that you give us your consent, okay? That the session is under recording. Again, it's up to you to decide how you would like to participate. You can switch off your camera, you can leave it on. You can choose, how to appear, what name to put. So absolutely, that's up to you. Okay. The format of colloquium is, again, a roundtable discussion. So that's why if you have any thought, any idea worth of sharing, please put it in the chat box. I would try to keep both, kind of facilitating the meeting itself as well as looking at the chat box, or just with this reactions at the very bottom of the screens. You can put your hand up, and then I will see the line of people with the questions, and I will give you the floor to ask your question. So today we discuss South Africa, and of course, as soon as we talk or start to talk or think even about South Africa, we can't help but think about help me with the pronunciation, Shane. Apartheid, right? Okay, apartheid. I know that the word originates from Afrikaans, right? And tide means hood. You see, I started. I started where the term comes from. So it's like statehood, nationhood, right? So apartheid or aparting laws, which were actually introduced, and Ellen is going to tell us more about that. So provides us with some historical background that we, kind of become better informed and more knowledgeable about the actual kind of the whole historical background of that. And after that, Shane kindly agreed to share with us his lived experiences, and as well to talk about not only about South Africa, but the African continent in general, right, Shane? And developing business there, and whether entrepreneurship has challenges, and whether there are more of those or less of those, or so all this. I believe that Shane is going to be supported by his DBA colleagues, who particularly, live in Africa. So I really hope I'm not going to name them now. I hope that they are going to raise their hand. I do not sound very bossy, and just volunteer, right, to contribute to the discussion. We would really all appreciate that. Okay, so having said that, Ellen, please, the floor is yours, and tell me, I'm your assistant. I have some video.
Yeah, you are indeed my assistant. Okay, well, hello everyone. My name's Alan. I wouldn't claim any expertise on South Africa. I teach history and politics, and I have over the years taught something about South Africa, but I'm not an expert. So what I thought we'd do is just start with a short film. It's about 6 minutes long, but I think it's useful because, quite frankly, it's very difficult to describe apartheid in anything other than kind of graphic images. So I thought if we just quickly watch this, it's 6 minutes, and then I'll try and give some of the historical background, some sort of context around the introduction of apartheid in 48, and some kind of ideas really about the end of apartheid. So here we go. Thanks, Tony.
Okay, so let me know if the sound is good, okay? Because I might share the sound, but it should be fine, okay? So let's see. Sound?
On April 27th, 1994, Nelson Mandela cast his vote in the first free and democratic elections in South Africa, marking the official end to racial oppression and apartheid rule. Apartheid, a term we've heard before, but what exactly is it? The word itself stems from the South African dialect of Dutch Afrikaans and literally means apartness. But for millions in South Africa, it held a much darker reality. It was a system put in place by the Afrikaner National Party in 1948, which allowed for lawful segregation using racial divides.
Will you intensify your present policy of racial segregation? The policy of, what do you mean by Whether any further measures are to come, it's impossible for me to say at the moment. I do not know of any.
The policy governed South Africa for nearly 50 years, but racial segregation existed long before apartheid even began. In 1913, the government passed the Natives Land Act, limiting Black African land ownership to 7% and restricting them from buying or occupying land except as employees of a white master. More than 3 decades later, the practice of systematic racial segregation was given the name apartheid and was extended under the government led by the National Party. The party's goal was to separate South Africa's white minority from its non-white majority, in addition to separating non-whites from each other. They did this by putting in place hundreds of race laws touching every aspect of life, preventing equal opportunities for basic human rights to people of color, including dictating where they could live, work, go to school, all based on their race. Interracial relationships and marriages were illegal, and perhaps most importantly, non-whites did not have a right to vote.
All these laws after 1948 had one purpose in mind, and that was to ensure that the 4 million whites in South Africa had all the resources, the wealth, the jobs, the minds concentrated in their hands.
The Race Classification Act put people in 4 different categories: white at the top, followed by Indian, colored or of mixed descent, and black at the bottom. And within those groups were subgroups, further segregating ethnic and tribal groups. A number of pseudo-scientific tests were used to classify individuals suspected of not being European. For example, the pencil test. This involved putting a pencil in an individual's hair. If the pencil fell to the floor, they passed the test and were considered white. If it stayed put, they were considered colored. Black South Africans were forced to carry identification at all times known as a passbook. Resistance to apartheid laws came in the form of mostly non-violent political protests. Together, freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Ahmed Kathrada started to play an important role for both the African and Indian National Congress parties. In 1952, they began a defiance campaign calling on people to purposely break apartheid laws in order to get arrested. People of color got onto white buses, used white toilets, and entered white areas. Their hope was that the high number of prisoners would cause the system to collapse. But it did not. Thousands ended up in jail. And in 1953, the Public Safety Act and Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed to impose even more severe penalties for demonstrating against the law. On March 21st, 1960, a protest against the use of passbooks turned violent in the Black township of Sharpeville, when police opened fire on unarmed protesters, leaving nearly 70 dead and 180 wounded, including children. A state of emergency was declared nationwide, and opposition political parties, including the ANC, were banned, forcing many to move their fight underground.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
By 1964, most resistant leaders, including Mandela, were sentenced to life imprisonment following the infamous Rivonia trials, which drew international attention. Eventually, a tide of global pressures put the government in a difficult position.
The world was changing. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and that was a major movement. There was increased calls for the divestment of companies from South Africa. There was a global movement to boycott South Africa.
Coupled with unrest within the country and the continued armed struggle, negotiations began between the ANC and the National Party. Slowly, apartheid began to dismantle. In 1990, at the age of 71, Nelson Mandela was released from prison.
I stand here before you, not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people.
Elections were held 4 years later, with the ANC winning 62% of the vote and Nelson Mandela becoming president. The people of South Africa won their country back, and apartheid was abolished.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
Thanks for watching Global News. If you enjoyed what you saw,
Right.
like the video. You can also hit the subscribe button for all the
Right. Thank you very much. Alan?
Okay, thanks, Tony. So the graphic scenes you saw early on in the famous massacre at Sharpeville in 1960, and in case I forget to mention, that led to the expulsion of South Africa a year later from the British Commonwealth. Anyway, I don't intend to talk for long. What I thought might be useful would be to firstly look at the historical context pre-1948, because as it clear, apartheid was going to just say something about the context of apartheid, as it were, in existence from 48 to, let's say, 1990. And thirdly, just suggest some possible reasons why it ended. So firstly, in terms of the history, the first white settlers into South Africa were from Holland. So it was a Dutch colony. They were known as Boers, which simply means farmer. And they settled in the southern part of the tip of Africa. Obviously, they encountered native tribes. As the 19th century wears on, as you go from the 17th century to 19th century, Britain acquires in 1815 Cape Colony at the very southern tip of South Africa. Actually, for the next more or less 100 years, apart from occasional conflicts with the British and the Zulus, the famous massacre in 1879, the conflict really was between two white forces. It was between the Boers and the Brits. And as the Brits arrived in the south, the Boers headed north in what was called the Trek. And we'll look at the map in a moment, but you can always tell the kind of Boer areas because the Dutch language, you're going to be looking at Orange Free State. Well, anything to do with Holland is orange. In the 1880s, 1890s, gold and precious minerals were discovered in South Africa. By then, Britain had already fought one war against the Boers in the 1880s, but another much more significant war was to come between 1899 and 1902. Remember, these are inter-white wars, okay? The natives, who clearly are the vast majority of the population, have no role, or at least have no agency. Britain, after a struggle, won the Boer War in 1902. It wasn't exactly a glorious British history. During that war, we essentially invented concentration camps, and I think something like 20,000 Boer civilians died in those camps. However, whilst the war itself was a disgraceful moment in British history, what followed was relatively constructive, I think. By 1910, incredibly quickly, the war only ended in 1902. By then, the British and the Boers together created the Union of South Africa. So, Tony, if you've got that first map, the 1910 map, it'd be quite useful.
Right.
If you have, if not, don't worry.
Is this helpful?
We just need the map from 1910. If don't worry, it's fine.
Oh,
no, don't worry.
Sorry. That's a wrong.
That's all right.
That's a wrong screen.
Right.
Hold on a second. I definitely have it. Just
Okay.
a second.
It's not a huge problem if you have.
If you keep talking meanwhile, Alan.
Okay, so what we're going to look at, if we can find a map, is the Union of South Africa, which is a dominion, that is to say, a self-governing entity within the British Empire, similar to Australia or Canada and so on. And I think it's worth stressing that the whole of, here we go. So this is now a united country under British rule. I think it's vital to stress, I'm sure everyone knows, but the whole of Africa had been colonized by Europeans. There were two solitary exceptions. One was Liberia up in the west, which was a home for former slaves from the US. And the other one was Abyssinia, latterly known as Ethiopia, which had defeated the Italians, but eventually would succumb to Italians. So the colonization by the Brits of South Africa is far from aberrant. It's the norm. And part of the point I was trying to make about the relative speed with which the Brits and the Boers worked together is that during World War I, not only did South Africa help Britain fight in the war, as did Britain's other colonies, but one of the former Boer leaders, Jan Christian Smuts, was actually in the British War Cabinet. And what you had at that point was Boer politicians like Smuts and Louis Botha, as kind of moderates in the sense that they were very happy to be in the British Empire. However, as the film made clear, and I think it's really important, although apartheid is only introduced formally in 1948, it referenced in that short film a law from 1913, essentially denying black South Africans ownership of land. So I think, you know, it's quite easy to get sort of moralistic about how dreadful apartheid was, which it clearly was. But we must avoid kind of pretending that somehow, you know, what came before was a policy of kind of racial tolerance, because it certainly wasn't.
Alan, I'm
Yeah.
sorry for interruption. So the map I'm sharing now, so basically that's how African continent looked before the first.
Yes, yes, and the two green areas are Liberia in the west and Abyssinia or Ethiopia in the northeast. And that's it. The whole of the rest of the continent of Africa have been colonized by Europeans in what was the partition of Africa in the late 19th century. Okay, so South Africa also fights alongside Britain in World War II, but there's less consensus around that. It's less of a sort of, you know, unified participation in the war, in the British war effort than the First World War had been. And in 1948, in a crucial election in 1948, the Nationalist Party, which was a Boer party, but not led by the likes of Smuts, but led by kind of hardliners, if you want, came to power and introduced, as we saw in the short film, this formalized system of apartheid, i.e. separate development. Now, again, I think it'd be helpful to contextualize this. This was just after the end of World War II, which, if it's anything, is a war against racism. And yet here we have in South Africa, and I liked the description in the film about pseudo-scientific race theories, which of course were very prevalent before World War II, you know, a kind of cod eugenics, if you want. So in 1948, when South Africa, when the nationalist government of South Africa introduces apartheid, what's going on is India had been given independence in 1947. Britain and France would withdraw from most of their African colonies by, let's say, 1964. And within a few years, the introduction of apartheid in 1948, you get real traction behind the American civil rights movement. You know, the early victories of the civil rights movement are kind of 1954 in the Supreme Court and so on. So in a sense, what I'm trying to describe is a situation in which apartheid South Africa from 1948 is kind of going against the grain almost. You know, whilst European empires have been dismantled, while civil rights is making great headway in the United States, we have this formalized racialized system in South Africa. And of course, you know, the majority of the population went back and yet denied the vote, hence the ANC's resort to a campaign of violence, which resulted in, amongst others, Mandela being sent to prison. And I think it's maybe helpful to point out as well that although South Africa was alone in formalizing the system, the neighboring British colony of Rhodesia, which, you know, becomes Zimbabwe, wasn't too far behind. I mean, in 1965, white Rhodesia declared unilateral declaration of independence from Britain. And so you had a kind of sort of apartheid system going on in Rhodesia as was. And at that stage, you still had Portuguese colonies in Mozambique and in Angola. Mozambique directly borders South Africa. And you know, Portugal at that stage was still a quasi-fascist state. So the point I'm trying to make is that although South Africa had formalized this further than anyone else, it had sort of relatively friendly neighbors, if you want. And then things begin to change. For example, in 1975, you have a revolution in Portugal, which overthrows the government, and both Mozambique and Angola achieve independence, and there are civil wars going on, and, you know, communist involvement and so on, which is clearly, you know, more damaging to South Africa. By 1979, the British government had arranged a kind of handover of power in Rhodesia, which then becomes Zimbabwe. So increasingly, as you get into the 70s, South Africa is becoming isolated in its apartheid regime. However, you know, I remember, you know, as a school student and then later on at university, things like, you know, sporting boycotts of South Africa, later on sanctions against South Africa. Those sanctions were resisted by both President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, but were eventually introduced. And what I hadn't realized was, as I said, South Africa was kicked out of the Commonwealth in 1961. What I hadn't realized, I must confess, because like Shane, I learned a lot reading up on this. I'd always thought it was de Klerk who came into power in 1989, who begun the process of reform, but in fact it began under his predecessor, So by the 1980s, you have some kind of movement, slow at first, to remove the worst of the past laws. I mean, for example, it mentioned in that short film that the worst of the past laws were removed, I think, in the mid-80s. And Mandela was removed from the prison. He'd served much of his time into a kind of more benign prison, still in prison nonetheless. And what I wanted to just kind of end my session with, and perhaps Shane will talk about this too, is why we think it came to an end. Because I'd be interested to know how much impact the sanctions had, the economic sanctions, and then the cultural boycotts. If you remember, many entertainers refused to play South Africa, for example. Right? How much pressure abroad helped? I mean, I remember, for example, in Britain, Free Nelson Mandela was a huge hit when it came out in 1984. Prior to that, we had Peter Gabriel's song Biko about the murder of Stephen Biko, the black activist, in 1977. We had various concerts here in London. I think one was in '88 to celebrate Mandela's 70th birthday. I wouldn't want to argue that the fall of apartheid is because of demonstrations and rock concerts in London. I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering how we allocate the weighting here. I mean, for instance, it struck me that normally when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was said to mean an end to weapons for terrorist organizations like, say, the IRA in Northern Ireland. But the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, by then Mandela had been freed. Mandela was freed in 90. You had that amazing moment when the Berlin Wall comes down in November 89, and then Mandela is freed in February 1990, I think. And so that coincides with the collapse of communism. So it seems to go against that grain as well. So I don't know, is my honest answer, how we allocate the sort of weighting for, what brought the end. Was it external pressure? Was it economic? I mean, apartheid in the end, I think, was a pretty lousy way of running an economy. It was hugely expensive to administer. The white population was declining from about 20%, I think, at peak of the total population to about 16%. And I guess that, thank goodness for those leaders, thank goodness for F.W. de Klerk, and thank goodness to Nelson Mandela. One of the constant themes we try to teach in history is how much importance do we attach to individuals and how much importance do we attach to structures. And I'm normally pretty skeptical about the importance of individuals, but I don't think you can look at this and not come away with anything other than an awareness that these individuals, de Klerk particularly, and Mandela, especially Mandela, obviously, deserve huge credit. And recently Desmond Tutu died, and Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now president of South Africa, heavily involved in the trade union movement, and so on and so on and so on. So I think it's really interesting, and I hadn't really thought about it before. Why does it end? Right? Because I grew up believing, I think we all did, that it would only end with a bloodbath, that the whites would not relinquish power with anything other than a kind of Armageddon scenario, and yet that didn't happen. And the handing over of power, first elections in 1994, was, of course, famously followed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which again, one has to, hugely admiring of all of that. So that's enough from me. I'm quite happy if anyone's got any questions later about the historical side. But I think it's more important I hand over to someone who's actually from South Africa, who genuinely knows what he's talking about. So over to you, Shane, I think.
Lovely, Alan. Thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. So what would you suggest, gentlemen? I mean, Alan and Shane, first of all. Yeah, Shane, so you go ahead, right? Okay.
I'm sharing my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah.
And is that an expanded mode?
No, it's not yet. If you press it, it's going to be. If you press this expanded mode button, yeah.
It is now?
No, try again. Just press it.
No?
No. Looks like you put it on and you never press it.
You have to press slideshow, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm pushing the slideshow, but it's not seemingly going in there.
Oh, strange.
Let's
Okay.
try it again. Let's
Shane,
try it again.
You can go to View in the toolbar on the top of your screen. You have the View option.
Yeah. Next to Help.
Next to Help, between Help and Review. Did you see it? On the very top.
Wait a second. Sorry, guys. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, at the very top, just click view.
I've got the, let me just stop sharing quickly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe if you start.
I got the bar was in the way there. Don't know why it looks fine on my side. It's crazy. Okay, let's try this again.
So how many years, Ellen, Mandela was in prison?
27. Can you see that now?
Mhm. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, Shane, looks good.
Okay, so thank you very much. So firstly, Professor Santalova, Professor Jasso, thank you, doctors, professors, esteemed colleagues and learned colleagues on this call, and the cognoscenti that are with us. I appreciate very much the opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about my beautiful little country that is under intense focus and the spotlight on a large worldly stage in general, and be able to give you a little bit of a taste as to what it's like being there. And I've lived there the first 40 years of my life. So hopefully I can bring a little bit of a flavor and give you kind of a introduction as to what it's been like. We're going to take a little bit of we'll touch on apartheid and build a little bit on what Ellen just presented. I think that video was very informative to give everyone a quick deep dive, touch on Mandela, of course, but more importantly, I wanted to show you a little bit about what we could potentially learn from South Africa. And I want to just pay tribute to Edward Yagi, our colleague in the DBA program. Last week's discussion on Japan made me think very much about how, Japan is a potential kind of almost, advanced situation of what we may see elsewhere in the world, so it got me thinking about what has happened in South Africa. What could we learn from it? How do we look through that lens to the greater Africa? What could come from that? Where do we go from here? How do we stop happening what is happening in certain parts of the world right now? I mean, if we don't heed the lessons from history, lest we let them happen again. So what could we take from this? And what does the world fundamentally need to make Africa successful? And why would we want that to happen? So I'm going to kind of walk through some of that. We've touched on the video already. So I want to try and provide you a bit of a global insight and a perspective from Africa. And we have some colleagues from our beautiful continent as well that I'd love to weigh in. And these are my opinions. So if you had to come to South Africa and I had to pick you up at the airport, I would take you on a little bit of a drive, and I would certainly tell you a little bit about the culture and the diversity, and get into a little bit about what's behind the curtain, to kind of give you a sense of the flavor and allow you to appreciate the cultural diversity and the warm people that you will meet. So I kind of thought I'd have a little bit of fun with this and kind of take you on a Sunday drive this beautiful Sunday morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you may be, and kind of do it in the same way. So synonymous with South Africa is obviously apartheid and then safaris. So I thought we'll get into the vehicle and we'll take a little bit of a drive. And I urge you to keep your hands and your feet inside the vehicle at all times, because we may find a couple of wild cats and wild dogs running around, and they're all over the place. So within about 45 minutes of Johannesburg International OR Tambo Airport, you could be seeing some of the most magnificent wildlife up close and personal. And it's a fundamental shift if you've never done it. To be able to see these animals in their wild glory is just beautiful and breathtaking, and certainly worth the trip. So hope to be able to show you that sometime. But today we want to talk about apartheid, a dark past, a tragic chapter in history, a sense of ashamedness in our country that we live with, and an atrocity we hope will never happen again. I come personally from a family that is a dual heritage of sort of Portuguese and Dutch descent, Afrikaans descent. I'm fluent in Afrikaans. I grew up on my mother's side, which is Afrikaans. And I would definitely say that the majority of my family is probably on the racist side of the category that I was born into, and had to make some fundamental shifts in the way I see things and what I was born into. And I grew up and voted in the first democratic election. I matriculated in 1994, was 18, and I voted in the first election. So this subject is particularly close to me as we've moved to the other side of the world in the USA, and my wife and I have taken a stance of stomping out any kind of discrimination and talking up against these kind of subjects because we're so passionate about it because of this dark history. So apartheid, we've touched on the white area and the segregation and the laws and how that separated the fundamental people, the blacks and the white community, and did the most atrocious things in separating these communities and causing a sub-level of living in such a large majority of the population. You need to remember it was the white minority ruling the majority. That is the fundamental issue. But above all these atrocities, not allowing them to vote was a massive, massive issue. And of course, the world cut us out. They boycotted us, they sanctioned us. And to Alan's point, I think that it did have a significant impact. I don't know, I think it was an accumulative one. I don't know if it was the only one. I think economically, obviously, the country was suffering because of these sanctions, but the voices started to build up momentum. And with these uprisings, the greats, the Bikos, the Mandelas, the Mbekis, and so forth, they stood up and were seen as terrorists by the whites and freedom fighters by the blacks. And, I grew up knowing this man as a terrorist. My family told me that he was a terrorist. That's how I grew up. So, when he was imprisoned and put on, he was in prison for 27 years. He spent 18 of them on that little island, which I visited. I've stood in that cell that he's looking out that window now. I wish I was in a room with you and I could show you how big it is, because to spend 18 years of his 27 years in that little cell, it's unbelievable. That tour, if you go to that Robben Island tour, you actually get taken around. The tour guide is a former inmate, someone that has lived there for years as a prisoner. They are the tour guides. You get I've got goosebumps at the moment just thinking about it, because it is so real, so raw, that it's hard to describe to you, but certainly worth a visit in terms of a cold shower and kind of wake you up a little bit sometimes, So with that, moving on to more positive sides of things, the age of Mandela, let's talk about what came afterwards. So, he was released in 1990, and in 1993, he started campaigning. This is my school. I was in that crowd in 1993. I was standing in that crowd somewhere. And this picture went viral because I don't know if you can see my cursor over here, but this little black boy on the right-hand side looking at the camera, everyone kind of focused on him in a sea of white faces. But this school was predominantly white, a British aristocratic school, a very wealthy private school, King Edward VII, a good boarding school. Suddenly we had this guy talking to us, and he was a former terrorist, and the shift started to happen. It was fascinating. I got to stand within a meter of this man, and I looked at him, and he's just a man. And I certainly had no level of respect for him at that point that I do for him now, having seen what he had done. So amazing to be in that crowd and actually personally see that. So there was this election that started off, obviously F.W. de Klerk was a huge proponent of moving this thing forward. And the first democratic election in 94, people queued for miles and miles. I voted in that election, ANC won it, and it was a peaceful handover of power, as Alan said, and a phenomenal one considering the bloodbath that was expected, feared, and professed. He installed 11 official languages and respect for all. It truly became the Rainbow Nation. There are 11 official languages. Our national anthem is sung in 3 sections. It's sung first in sort of the Zulu, Swana, then it moves to Afrikaans, then it moves to English. And it's interesting to watch how it kind of ramps up, because a lot of the people don't know all the languages. So it kind of like crescendos a little bit at the end. But it's we've seen the sporting side of the world, movies like Invictus, and the sport galvanized it. The sport was almost like a medium that brought the people together, soldered the white and the blacks together for like this communal purpose. South Africans are very sporty, very aggressive on the sports field. And this was like, the common enemy, whoever the other team was, and it galvanized the country, and winning these World Cups timing was impeccable. It became the Rainbow Nation. And this gentleman over here, wow, what a factor he has been, how he has changed the world, and his legend continues to grow. But above all else, this always hit me, where he said, no one is born to hating another person because of the color of their skin and their background and their religion. People must learn to hate. That is so true. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally than the human heart, than its opposite. And I think that is so profound. And that always stood with me. It always really did. And then, of course, we have Gandhi. So I'd like to say Gandhi spent 21 years of his life in South Africa. So 21 of his 78 years. So I can't probably claim him a South African, but 21 of 78 is 26.9%. So I think we can claim 27% of Gandhi as well. So the present, what can the world learn from South Africa? Let's talk about the economy. What happened? So the boycotts ended, the sanctions lifted, the world welcomed South Africa back, and foreign investment flowed in. Many international companies set up in South Africa, seeing it as a gateway to sub-Saharan Africa, having a little more confidence to kind of go in there than maybe some of the other parts of the continent. Global brands flocked to the country. Latest technologies arrived. We kind of went from having no cell phones, where Japan had cell phones for 20, 30 years, to suddenly getting the latest technology and leapfrogging many countries where you get this latest injection of technology. And that was interesting, to suddenly go from nothing to having everything. Many new jobs were created along the way. We started seeing the economy change and GDP start to go up, and kind of signal that this was a good call. Zooming out a little bit and looking over the years, you start seeing the GDP increase dramatically. And only after a few years ago being overtaken by Nigeria, I think about 2014 or 2016, the economy took over. So, a massive change in gross domestic product, should I say. And you can see it on these trends, how it changed just in those 15 or 16 years in between the democratic election and the next millennium. Brands came. You didn't have to go to New York or to Paris. You could just go to Sandton City and you'd have every fancy brand you could ever want. They all arrived in South Africa on our doorstep. And looking at Africa, the top part of the leading companies on the list, the top echelon of business, was really all South Africa, and kind of just seemed to create more and more momentum. With that came tourism. So, tourism, if you look at the blue being the tourist kind of, arrivals in terms of thousands, you can see how that's gone up. And you can see, from where it was originally, no one was visiting, it was boycott. And the black is the influx of US dollars that pays a lot in terms of the currency. And there's so much diversity to see in South Africa. I mean, let's just talk about that. The major attractions in this rainbow nation is this little tip of the continent that can fit into Texas. And in its breadth, left to right, a span of 12 hours of drive across it in 12 hours, is literally like going from Miami on the East Coast to California on the West Coast in a very short drive. And you have a major change of topography and botany and life. And it is a fascinating diversity that is true to the Rainbow Nation's name. So worth exploring, just because you can get so much done in such a small area. We've got the Big Five. That's me playing with a little elephant calf. You can play with them. That's me diving with great white sharks. That's my photo. You can swim with great whites. This is a 17-foot female. You can go surf on some of the biggest waves on the tour. See the most beautiful botany in the world. If you're into botany, there are things growing here like feinbush you'll find nowhere else in the world. You can play golf with a Big Five, where your caddy has got the 15th club as a rifle. And if you're into anthropology, this would be your Graceland, because there's such rich dig sites and so much history there. I think the only older fossils they've ever found in the world have been a few in Ethiopia, but there's such rich dig sites, and most South Africans have never even been here. The wine, wow, the wine, I think enough said. Thank you to those French Huguenots that visited. And you can visit places like Cape Town that are the most magnificent tourist sites, and you can probably do 4 or 5 of the activities I just described in the space of one day. So a lot to see. Sport and culture came, stadiums were built, World Cups were housed, a lot of jobs were created, bids for the Olympics, soccer World Cups, Formula One, so forth and so on. Money just kind of flowed. And, although there hasn't been Olympics in Africa, there's a big, strong push to have it have it held and hosted in South Africa going forward. But let's talk a little bit about Reformation and Black economic power. So sport was great and tourism was all good. Then it started to get a little bit more real. We started to see some changes settling in. Let's talk about that. So BBBEE, or broad-based Black economic empowerment, started to form in businesses, which basically was you'd be audited, you'd be certified that you have a certain level of Black or colored presence, and you would get rated. And basically, if you were white majority in that company, you would have a poor rating, and if you were Black owned, ideally more than 50%, so 51% plus, you'd get a good rating. And basically, your rating would affect your customers' rating. So you are affected by your vendors, and so it cascades. And basically, it creates this push to accelerate, Black communities coming in and getting more senior positions. Now, obviously, there is an argument to be made for that to accelerate Reformation, but it brought with it a lot of challenges. And that was the unintended consequences. So basically, instead of the money getting to the right people would set up shell companies and have 51% of a company's revenue coming to them, but they were a shadow. They don't do anything for it. So business did not improve. Business got worse. People were put in positions that didn't know how to command those positions. They weren't trained. They weren't set up for it. And they were set up for failure fundamentally. It started to get to the point where it even moved into sports teams, and it still does. And where if you had 7 white players in a cricket team, now you had to have 1. And the problem was performance, and the level and the standard of that sportsman was secondary concern. But you are playing the best teams in the world on the world stage, but you have to have a quota. It seemed to be as a kind of like an anchor pulling you. You kind of see the long-term proposition, but there's a lot of short-term pain in getting there. These quotas have become a serious source of consternation. As I mentioned, lack of training, cultural integration, and soft skills on how to bring this. This is a lot of change in a very short amount of time. People get stressed up about this. Companies that are headquartered in the US suddenly have their company in South Africa having to go through all these changes, and they feel like they don't have control of it. It's a lot of change. Academic acceptance. You'd have a medical school, for example, saying, well, we can only have 250 students coming into the medical program. We can only have 5 whites. And some of those people might be getting in with C or D aggregates, C or D averages, and not A aggregates. So, academic acceptance became a big focus as well. And a lot of people started to get very nervous about this and started to leave. So on that education front, the big problem we've had is with the Black community wasn't allowed to vote, was also the education was often absent or really subpar. Country has spent a lot of time and money in trying to invest in the education, understanding how important it is. It's got better, but it still ranks rather poorly on the global education system when you look at it holistically. Only about 3% of South African population currently has university degrees, which is about 1.7 million. It's very, very little matriculation. If you look at countries like Germany and so forth, and the high percentage pales in comparison, and is a stark reminder of the base that it is starting from. And there's been a significant improvement. There certainly has. Between 94 and 2014, it is more than quadrupled in terms of that injection and improvement, but lots of work still to be done. And I think a big barometer, a large barometer and a finger on the pulse situation of this is really the math and the science scores that score poorly relative to the world. When you look at the top performers in Singapore and Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and so forth, we rank rather poorly at the bottom, and it's always a sign as to where we are falling short. But most importantly, the concerns that I've always had is the standards. I feel there was a large window dressing exercise by the government to prove that they were doing things well and improving it, but suddenly this was slipping, and they started to window dress the results. They started to drop the performance standards that you needed 30 or 40%, 35% to pass a subject. You had people matriculating after 12 grades with 30, 40% averages, going to university. The universities have not dropped their international accreditations and standards, and suddenly these people struggling to close that gap and flunking out. It still is a significant concern on how some of those standards have been dropped worldwide. Compared to the worldwide. The brain drain all leads into this. A lot of people flocked. I was one of them. I left and went to the US 6 years ago. People left to New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the UK. You know, we've lost people like Elon Musk, you know, great entrepreneurs, and Mark Shuttleworth, to other parts of the world. And, you know, interestingly enough, though, there are those that talk about the coming back, and ultimately coming back and trying to bring those skill sets back into Africa. And, you know, I think if certain conditions had to change, we would see that influx. And there's a genuine sense that if you're not going to do it, who else is going to, kind of mantra. So that is interesting to watch, and, you know, see what works in the rest of the world and how could Africa thrive because of it if I had to take that back. Life expectancy. It's moving through this quickly in the interest of time. HIV has been a problem. Mandela spent a lot of time, not in his campaign, but after his presidency, pushing for social acceptance and social awareness, public awareness. Because you see, in Africa, often a Black person would consider his wealth in terms of the number of his children. The more children he has, the wealthier he is in many cultures. And if you're suddenly told to wear a condom, it's like, are you trying to stop me from, you know, growing my family? And there is a whole cultural shift in these kind of things. Mandela spent a huge amount of time trying to create public awareness to control HIV and bring that in. And then suicide rates is an important thing to talk about as well. With people getting shoved into these positions they maybe weren't ready for, we saw suicide rates go through the roof. One person in South Africa, because of unemployment, may support 20, 30 people. Plus a company at their command now, they suddenly have a huge amount of pressure on their shoulders. All of these things of trying to accelerate change and accelerate reformation brought with it a lot of sideline unintended issues. On the unemployment side of things, you know, a stark, extraordinarily high, unacceptable number has been the unemployment rate, 35%. It's probably even higher than that. You know, they talk about the official number and the expanded number. It's probably close to 40% at the moment. If you look at the US being in the order of like 4% at the moment, there is just so much unemployment. Now, to be fair, you know, back in 94, it was 20%. The country started expanding and they did add a lot of jobs, but just not enough to lower the overall number. It's kind of this goal that's running away the whole time. And, you know, it's such a significant factor. It's probably one of the most important challenges that the public wants the government to address in recent referendums. Demographic quotas don't help when there's a position open and you want to apply for it, but it says you have to be the following, you know, race demographic to apply for a position, and you could be wanting to work but can't get the job. And of course, illegal immigrants. There's a lot of people coming into the country from other neighboring countries that see South Africa as a greener pasture and trying to get work themselves because the situations in their countries are more dire. To that point, you know, because of its attraction on the middle income status and the stable democratic institution, it attracts a lot of people. You see Mozambicans, Zimbabweans, Malawians. To my colleague Pilot, we always joke in South Africa to our fellow Zimbabwean brothers over there, we always joke, you should come visit us because all your stuff's here already. So anytime you want to come over. But, you know, official estimates are 2.9 million people, but it's probably way higher than that. And, you know, that's not to say that it's, you know, just because of the 94 election, that was an attraction, but obviously because of their wars and so forth as well, we can understand that they'd be looking to move to a better scenario. On an immigration level, a lot of people have left and gone to other countries accordingly. And a lot of them because they were disillusioned by the Black government and, you know, what would follow. Kind of the African, I guess the white view would almost be, well, if things go really well, we could have the next Australia. But if things go really badly, we could have a fallen Rhodesia under Mugabe kind of thing. And, you know, what is it going to be? And kind of have a chance to get out, almost like that kind of mentality in a lot of people's minds. And basically the population of the whites reduced down to the order of about 8% now. So the decline goes on, and, you know, just moving in the interest of time, it hasn't just been the whites. A lot of Black people have left too, just seeing more opportunity overseas, possibly xenophobia sentiments growing with a lot of neighboring immigrants coming in. So it's been interesting to watch the flux inward and outward accordingly. Poverty, one of the most unequal societies in the world. You know, the haves and the have-nots. About top 10% of South African wealth holders own more than 85%. it is a stark wealth inequality situation, and more than 55% live on the poverty line or below it. So there have been improvements, but just not enough. And out of 56 million people, only about 11% pay taxes. Now, when you are trying to improve infrastructure and bring in what you need to move forward, that's a lot of weight on very few shoulders. And talk about corruption and that kind of thing. In the interest of time, I'll move through this quicker. But corruption is a concern. It's rife in Africa. It's kind of in your face a little bit, and a lot of companies overseas turn to not want to deal with that and kind of move away from that. But there's a lot of money lost just opportunistically to corruption every single year that scares a lot of people off. Bottom line is, we need infrastructure. We need electricity, which, if you don't have it, slashes your productivity and your GDP, and obviously the needs for your domicile, and is a serious hampering right now in South Africa. South Africa, for example, provides power to many of the neighboring countries, but doesn't have enough power for itself. And they have these rolling blackouts where you could spend 2 to 6 hours, 8 hours a day without power, happening right now, and has been happening for the last 6, 7, 8 years. Crime. South Africa is known for a high level of crime, obviously linked very strongly to the unemployment rates and the problems that comes with that, and the wealth disparity. We have failed as a country to secure confidence and respect for the law. The level of police, it's a tough job anywhere, but specifically in South Africa, not a high level of respect for it, and people just don't feel safe in South Africa right now. I mean, you need to live in a private compound with a guard shack in the front, with 6 to 8 foot high walls, electric fencing, an alarm system, security company. That was the life that I had. And you live in a beautiful house, but when you go outside of it, you don't feel safe. And you can see from the countries where people felt the safest, certainly we were not on that list. We're on, unfortunately, the wrong end of that. And we don't have quite the gun violence, but if you look at, for example, compared to the US, probably 5 to 7 times the rate of violent crimes, but it's 7 times smaller population-wise. And I think that says a lot. Another significant factor we need to change to bring everything else in line. More importantly, what can we learn from this? So I love this by Mandela, where he talks about, being that leader without title and being able to lead from behind. Kind of testament to a great man, and what a legend he is. But this is what I want you to take away from this today. I think the fall of apartheid 28 years or so ago, it is possible to end institutionalized racism. We've seen that. How exactly it happened, and what the forces were, and what played what contribution, as Alan said, is interesting. But it's testament that it can happen. And I think we all need to look at our areas where we live, as big or small as that racism may be, or that discrimination may be, it can be stomped out. Healing takes time. This is probably my biggest reflection on this whole exercise. Reformation is slow. It takes time. I'm not a social scientist, but my brother went out to Auschwitz, and he did a whole tour of the whole Nazi regime and that kind of thing. He came back and he gave me a stat, and I can't remember the exact details, but he spoke of something like it takes like 7 generations to truly forget. I don't know what the real number is, and maybe that's something worth digging into some time, but it takes time. There was a significant misunderstanding of that. People thought that you would almost just after the democratic elections in 94, someone comes into the first grade, they go through 12 years of schooling, leave the 12th grade, matriculate, and everything will be fine. That was the belief of most people in South Africa. They thought all would be well. Introduce quotas, which haven't helped. Education, you need to work hard to get the standard up. It is not an easy thing, because even teachers, getting enough good teachers and teaching them to the right standard. I mean, you can all reflect on great teachers you've had in the past. We need more teachers and more great teachers to pay that forward. You need to work really, really hard to get this right. You need to raise those standards, not drop them. Raise them up. People will lift up to meet those standards. Develop people. Don't let them set up for failure. Don't put them in a position untrained and out of their depth. Set them up for success. Do all of this right, and you'll curb the brain drain. Install programs to help people. Educate them. Education in Africa is such a huge tenet. it is so important because there's so much distrust. Education is absolutely key. Curb the crime and safety, be aggressive, stomp out corruption. Above all else, like Mandela, hold your leaders accountable because they are there to serve, not to get. And it gets allowed too often, and we remember that maxim. And of course, build the infrastructure, not just for now, but for 30 years in the future. Set it up because that is what we're struggling with right now with energy and power, and most parts of Africa are probably true in the same. Address poverty and unemployment. These are all very, very complex, challenging subjects, easy to put on a slide and say, these are the things we need to do. And this is true of many parts of the world, of course, but it can be done. And you can make a difference. You can be the change. And it takes all of us to do this. So why does the world need Africa to be successful? Well, there's only 2 trillion collective gross domestic product between all 54 states. Only 2 trillion combined. Investors want stability and structure. They don't want to touch places that are unstable and war-torn. But there's a highly attractive proposition on the horizon, and that is it is the fastest growing middle class in the world. There's over 1 billion people now, about 1.1, 1.2 billion, but by 2050, there'll be 2.4 billion. A lot of middle class. It is resource rich, minerals, agriculture, arable land, more than anywhere else. And it's there and available. People just need to be able to set up these transactions in a reasonable, sustainable way and invest. And as you can see, these countries are on a global level have a lot of wealth to bring from gold and diamonds and platinum and manganese and coal and so forth, resources that are limited in this world today. 60% of the world's untouched arable land, 10% of the world's oil reserves, and so forth. And too many of the companies on the top list in Africa are South African. The other countries need to get onto this list so we can see the same kind of thing happen in the rest of Africa as we've seen in South Africa. But education and entrepreneurship is the key, I believe. And I don't think the people on this panel, on this call today, I have to oversell this. But education probably is the most powerful weapon that we can use to change the world, and certainly Africa along the way. Entrepreneurship, we need to get more private enterprise, get away from the public sector because it's just wholly inadequate. Entrepreneurship is a key factor, but easier said than done. We know there's collective untapped genius, but entrepreneurship needs to be trained and taught. You need to be taught how to think like that. You can't just wait for the Elon Musk to, statistically pop up. We need to teach this. And we maybe need to bring a bit of an African approach and not just a Western doctrine to it, because it might be slightly different. So I coined the term Africaneurship. I typed it in and I kind of liked it. So I'm going to put kind of my name on that. I don't know if it exists truly. I couldn't find it. So just remember that. So there are IT hubs popping up all over the place. It's exciting to see IT starting to come, and normally that is a good sign of acceleration. And the continent lacks competition, so data is expensive, but it's starting to improve. Google, Facebook, those kind of companies are starting to invest. 4G connection, fiber optics. Speed is going to increase by 7-fold this year already. It's starting to happen. So education in Africa, paying it forward. What can you do? In closing, Ubukhle is an orphanage that a group of our family and friends have kind of sponsored. And in Africa, in Bronkhorstspruit, we built a school with a computer center for kids in the middle of the bush. And it's a Christian nonprofit organization. And this lady, Melanie Prinsloo, was a CEO of a private company doing very well for herself, well accredited, well trained, MBA, and she left the private sector CEO position and took this on because this is where her passion lies, with the mantra of raising children, the next generation, educate them well, make them literate, develop impeccable character and morals, should I say, and allow them and teach them to make a positive contribution, to work hard, make a good living for themselves, not to just expect, but to go and make that happen and then pay it forward and give back to the community. So in the last few years, we've managed to do this. It grows year by year. Every year we build on. And I ask you that you go and check out Ubukhle Orphanage. It's an impressive little startup and something that people can get behind. People just need a vehicle. People want to help. They need a vehicle, and everyone is out there to help the next person go forward. In closing, Africa has tremendous potential. It's fast growing. It is underestimated and misunderstood at this stage. And I think a lot of innovation and investment is going to be needed to fulfill the demand that is naturally going to come when these markets suddenly start to open up. But these two key indicators are important over here. Out of the 10 fastest growing economies in 2018, 6 were in Africa. And from a business index, 5 of the 10 most improved countries are in Africa. 1/3 are all reforms recorded globally. So there is a shift. People are starting to take notice. And I think we're on the precipice of something important. And 5 key trends: population that's fast and growing and urbanizing. In the next 8 years, you will have 17 cities that have more than 5 million people. That's a lot of market for a lot of companies. It's industrializing. With the right technology and the right advancements, in the next few years, you can double productivity. They're going to need lots and lots of goods to satisfy this growth, and infrastructure gaps will close. There is a lot of agriculture, a lot of minerals, a lot of resources. We need to have sustainable markets set up, and of course, close this digital and mobile divide. There's a lot of opportunity as an entrepreneur. And finally, everyone will know the Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am kind of scenario. Well, I'd like to introduce you to something from Africa, imparting Ubuntu. Ubuntu is an ancient African Zulu proverb, but it has a dual meaning, and I love the dual meaning. So on one end, it stands for humanity. Nice. But more importantly, Ubuntu says, I am what I am because of whom we all are. And there is unity in strength, and there is strength in diversity, and we can come together. And what has happened in South Africa, although it's not perfect and work in progress, it can be done, and we all need to do our little part. So from my part of the world, I say, Nyabonga, Nitemba Uguti Nonke, Nizavakashela Izwe Lami Elikle, Ningizimu Africa, Futi Nizibonele, which is thank you, and I hope you all visit my beautiful country. Thank you.
Wow, big round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you, Shane. Thank you both, Alan as well. That was fascinating. No, really, I really mean it. I have so many questions, but I see already the hands up. So please, Edward. Questions, comments?
Thank you very much, Shane, for that fascinating and educational presentation. 3 really quick comments. I strongly recommend a book called The Scramble for Africa by Thomas Pakenham. He's a British historian. He's still alive. He's in his 80s now, I think, almost 90. There are many excellent books on the colonization of Africa. And if you only have time to read one, I strongly recommend. It's called The Scramble for Africa. It's comprehensive. It's witty. It's an excellent book. My second comment is we had a session recently in this school about brain function, about brain development. And we now understand that we now know that the brain actually continues to develop well into the mid-20s for the most part. And we also know that the last things to develop in the human brain are the highest level functions. And these functions are things like extremely long-term thinking, thinking collectively, thinking beyond your self-interest, empathy, but also self-reflection. Self-reflection is one of the highest levels of human capacity, and it's very difficult for many people to develop this skill, even as adults, and it's even more unusual for societies to self-reflect and to admit error, to admit failure, to admit mistakes, to show contrition, and to reverse policy. Human history has very few examples of self-reflection that rank very high and lonely in the historical record. German contrition regarding the Holocaust is one. Anwar Sadat's reversal of Arab policy towards Israel in 1977 is another. And South Africa's abandonment of apartheid is yet another. It's something to be very proud of. It's a rare example in history of recognizing that a policy is wrong, it's not working, it's self-destructive, and to do a 180. So it's a remarkable thing. And the last thing is I have spent a lot of time in Africa. I lived in Kenya for 3 years. I lived in Egypt for 4 years. I have been to South Africa several times on business. I have tremendous respect and admiration for the countries of Africa, and I've given many presentations on it. And one of the lines that I think I created that I use in a lot of presentations is this: when you are in Africa, half the time, the only thing you can think of is getting away. However, when you're away from Africa, the only thing you can think of is getting back. And I have to say that it's been 7 or 8 years since I've been back to Africa, and not a day goes by that I don't wish that I were back. And I look forward to visiting your country and other countries in Africa again in the near future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, so much. So we know the next destination of Edward, where he's moving from Japan. Right. Okay. Thank you. Adebisi, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Very awesome, great presentation, Shane. I did see. I just wanted to, add a few things,
Please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
We can. If you say the country at DBC you're joining from, that could be lovely as well.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm joining from Nigeria, Lagos to be precise. And, we are very close business relationship with South Africa. I also do run a few businesses in Africa, with a multinational. And I just want to share, a few, points as well, just to add to what Shane has mentioned. So I noticed, most times in Africa, we try to rely, on the global economy, on the developed country like the Europe and North America, for us to be able to boom. But also, I feel if we begin to develop local policies that would help and, facilitate intra-African trade, South Africa, Nigeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Kenya. If we start, working more with policies like this, it could help, because we see a lot of exports go from, this country to outside of Africa. I mean, we have our gold, cocoa, and all this stuff going into, Europe, into the US. And I mean, the biggest chocolate company in the world is Switzerland, and they don't have, a kg of cocoa. Can we have something, policies locally, like that will help facilitate, business transactions like this, and in turn also build the economy locally? Recently, the AfCFTA, was, put into law. I'm not sure if you guys know, it's an African Free Trade Agreement, sort of. So this policy is supposed to help, the African nations. All the 54 of the 55 nations in Africa are members of this state. And, they're supposed to have like a free, policy between, to encourage intra-trading between different countries within Africa. And some of the countries have started, to do this. South Africa, for instance, has what you call, the SADC with Kenya or with Tanzania, where, when you bring in something from outside the world, they charge you 10% duty. But when you bring stuff from South Africa, you don't get to pay this money. They have, the same relationship, with Kenya. Can we, look at, internally to see how we can build concepts, like this? Because it's okay to always say, let's rely on the global and the Western world. But how much, have we relied on ourselves? Do we plan to be self-reliant at some point? Or do we want to continue to ask these people for what they've taken 200, 300, 400 years ago? It's, just a food for thought. I thought, I should add, right. And maybe we can continue to brainstorm.
Yeah, I think it's a great point at the BC, and a lot of my reading in prep for this was about Africa potentially being the next China. Kind of the smokeless stacks business, because of the resources and the workforce and all that kind of thing. It being the next China and trying to produce more and import less. Yeah, so that could be very interesting.
And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Last Sunday, we spoke about this demographic actually crisis, right, in Japan,
Yes.
and that maybe it's not that obvious now, but definitely in a couple of decades that's definitely going to hit and hit badly the country. And what I see in African continent, so that's the opposite, right? So that's the youngest population on the earth. And
Right.
that per se means that, there is this potential, there is this, the growth opportunities are there on that continent. Absolutely. Pilot is joining from Zimbabwe. Pilot, go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Shen. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I was very proud, and I'm proud to be a neighbor of South Africa because we have got a very strong history with the South Africans.
We do.
Pilot,
Yeah.
do you plan now to move to South Africa like other people from your state, since Zimbabwe is #1 country, right? Sending people to South Africa.
I will stay in Zimbabwe and build it from here.
Okay, good.
Certainly. Okay, maybe just a few points to add to Shen's great presentation. I think from the Democratic Front, South Africa has been playing a very important role in Africa in general. It has been exemplary. If you look at, they've managed to hold elections since 1994, and none of those elections have been contested. And they've also played a very important role in mediating conflict in other African countries. So their role in Africa is really appreciated by many Africans because of that role that they play. And also besides that, just to add, I think it's a major trading partner even of my own country. Many Southern African countries, they depend on South Africa on raw materials, even also on infrastructure in terms of, you mentioned issues of electricity. They also share electricity with even in our country, Zimbabwe, and many other Southern African countries. So South Africa is really very important to us as Africans, to us also as Zimbabweans. It's a very important partner that we have. And if I should add to say that during South Africa's liberation struggle, we also assisted a lot as Zimbabweans because we're keeping some of the ANC cadres in Zimbabwe. So what's happening now, Shane, that graph that you showed, Zimbabweans coming to South Africa, it has also been, I think, an opposite graph because in the 1970s and late 80s, most South Africans were being housed here in Zimbabwe.
When they were in exile,
running
that's
away
right,
from, running away from apartheid South Africa. So thank you so much. I think those are just the points that I wanted to add.
Thanks,
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Pilot. Brilliant. Sergio.
Hi, thank you, Professor.
Hi, Sergio. Sergio, what country are you joining from?
I'm actually in South Africa. I'm in Johannesburg.
I thought so.
Hey.
I was going to say that.
Sawubona.
Sawubona.
Kunjani?
Kona njani, Pap?
Nazikona.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. I think, Sean, that was a fantastic presentation. I like the way you put it in chronological order. It was just perfect. I think my only contribution is small. I've done a few businesses in Africa, in South Africa specifically. I think I've been in South Africa for the past 20 years. I'm originally from Zambia. And really the way you explained it, especially when it comes to entrepreneurship, I think the biggest challenge, this is just my contribution, my opinion, the biggest challenge is really access to capital. I think Africa has got the resources. Africa has got the human resource, it's got the natural resource.
Right.
It's got opportunities, huge opportunities, actually insurmountable. I mean, I did some work in Angola a few years ago. It was amazing what I found there. But the most critical thing is actually access to capital. The way things have been structured, and I think up to now, government has the money. The private sector has the money, but the private sector that has the money is actually, for lack of a better term, exclusive. If you look at the businesses, the entities you're talking about getting into Africa, they could be 10, 20, 200, 300, but they are all interlinked in one way or the other. Now, at an African stage or at a Black stage in South Africa specifically, that access to capital to actually do that kind of business, that level of business, whether locally, whether it's a mukuku, whether it's a small shop you want to raise in a township. We take Soweto. Soweto is popular. Everybody knows about Soweto. I was doing some business in Soweto 2 years ago. The biggest challenge I had is the guys I was supposed to employ actually didn't have just money to keep coming to work on a daily basis. In as much as you can pay them enough, the extended family is so large, the money they get is good commensurate to the level they are at, but it's actually not enough to look after the people around them because of the extended family system we have in South Africa. Now, getting a loan to cover that in the short term for you to sustain yourself in the long term won't work because you don't have access to capital. Anyway, that's my long and short in terms of contribution to your presentation.
That's very interesting. Could I ask you a question? So Shane mentioned this BBBEE program in place. Broad-based Black economic empowerment. So how do you feel? I mean, it's still in place, right? Kind of.
Yes, that's still in place.
Okay.
To be honest, like Sean, right? Oh, sorry, did I cut you? You wanted to add some more?
Yeah, Sergio, no, just your opinion. How do you feel that? Because you're a business owner, or you are there in the country. So basically, how do you feel? Does the program meet the expectations, or maybe that should be adjusted, or just your thoughts?
Okay. Anyway, like Sean rightly put it, it's still in place, but it's been a phenomenal failure.
Okay.
And in my opinion, why it has failed, again, it's cronyism. You see, you're coming from a society where there are two things that are happening here. There's who you're connected with, one, and your level of education. So the BEE system brought in a case where let's get in as many Blacks as possible into business settings, if you may, so that there's some equitability on how resources and funds and everything is distributed within the country. But then you're bringing in people who don't have the capacity to actually do what you think they can do. So ultimately, they fail. And when they fail, a few came up. I mean, there are a few names that we can mention. You've got Mosepe, who's done very well, the richest Black in South Africa. He benefited from BEE. You've got Toko Sekwale, who benefited. Our current president benefited from the same system. But there are very, very few people who actually benefited. Again, it came to a case where only the ones who are educated and intelligent enough to actually apply it can do it. But you're coming from a base where people are uneducated. So it is really a huge, huge failure. I think personally, that's how I see it.
So the education, again, education, and education.
100%, 100%.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Sergio. Sean and then Martin. Sean.
Good morning, everybody. Good to be with you. And thank you, Tony, for the platform. Excellent. Great speeches today. Excellent job. Just a couple. Can I show my screen for a second?
Yeah, you can.
In 2006, I finished my PhD in politics, political economy. And one of the very first published papers I ever did was on Africa. And because I had to take a regional politics, I had to study a part of the world. I literally threw a dart on a wall in spirit, and it ended on Africa. So I did a whole thing on Africa, and my first published paper, I think it's one of like the first ones, is this thing here. I thought since it's a research institute, maybe you find it as interesting. The political risk of the candy bar, and since you guys mentioned cocoa, investing in African cocoa, this whole thing is about Cote d'Ivoire and the Ivory Coast, which happened to be in a civil war, exporting cocoa to Western nations and all over the world. So I think you're right. We all want to get back to Africa. And I was listening to the two talks, and what seems very present and challenging, I suppose, an opportunity. But in order to get FDI, which is seemingly the way forward for South Africa, Entrepreneurship. What did you call it? Excuse me. Africaneurship. I like that.
There you go. You like that?
You better go copyright that one quickly.
Yeah.
Is the only way that you get FDI to sustain itself, that's real FDI, foreign direct investment, is clarity of the rule of law. So that's, I'm not telling anyone what to do, but that's obviously going to be an opportunity for South Africa to really nail down the rule of law. That's a big question mark. The tax base was quite fascinating. That seems to be problematic, of course. And then the whole thing of affirmative action, which was part of the American tradition, which was deemed unconstitutional within the last couple of years, decades actually, is interesting. Reverse discrimination,
that's right,
seems to be problematic there. So none of us know the future of this country. We all have great ideas and great consultancy, but once, eliminating corruption seems to be job number one. And then the rule of law seems to be job number one. How that plays out, that's up to all of you in this, and all of us, I suppose, but all of you in the investment into the education. UBIS is a great opportunity to get that access to higher education to South Africans and Africans alike. So it was a pleasure to hear from the two talks. And again, thank you for your contributions today. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Sean. So the thing is that how is it possible that the resources turn into the curse, right? I mean, ideally, kind of thinking about that. Martin, maybe you could address, if you can, this comment of mine as well. I know that you have your point as well. So Martin.
Well, the resources being a curse, I think, is probably to do with corruption. That if whoever owns the resources can pay people to go around the law, whatever, and it distorts an economy as well. So I think there's two problems with resources. But my question was about African culture. My younger son he lived in South Africa for about 20 years. And he taught in Zambia for a year. And that was very instructive because there were some Spanish monks who had been paid by their local community in Spain to set up this school to teach agriculture, teach modern agricultural methods in the rural Zambia. And they would give the villagers seeds and buckets for water and this sort of thing, and teach them irrigation. But because of the extended family values, people couldn't keep the seeds. They had to give the seed corn away because somebody else in the family was hungry. The idea that you had to keep the seed corn to grow next year's crop was less important than feeding a member of the extended family now. And so there was a real cultural barrier to the idea of investment for future return. And I'm wondering whether that cultural difference, if you like, in some ways it's a virtue, family values, but it's a bit of a problem vis-a-vis entrepreneurship, and maybe Africaneurship would have to find some way of harnessing or in some way mitigating this particular effect.
Interesting, Martin. Thank you very much. Also in our chat box, Hussein writes that tribal traditions and the prevailing culture might be considered a big obstacle, in addition to the extent of government corruption as a major factor in keeping the differences large between the rich and the poor. And so cultural factors. So Shane, anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think my African brothers there can chime in here, but I think it's a cultural hot pot that I think it's been done elsewhere in the world. I think I've spent a lot of time in Asia too, and I've always witnessed how they'll have these strong family historic values, but live in a very modern society. I believe there could be a synergy. I think it could be found. There's a lot of different tribes and a lot of different values, and I think they can coexist. I think you need to want to do it. And I think, again, education is the glue that joins it all together. I think awareness and getting around people's biases and, Also, I think there's this phenomenon of trans kind of what would they call it, like transgenerational trauma, where stuff passes on generation to generation and often it becomes legacy, and it's not necessarily true. Education, I truly believe, is probably the most simplistic answer. I know it's not a simple thing, but I believe that those two things can exist in harmony. I do believe. I don't think you have to throw out the values. I think they can be embraced, but with a modern focus on things scientifically and in a methodical way to get the best of all things and still stay true to your principles that don't need to be challenged. I think there is some way we can do that. I don't know if anybody else wants to maybe chime in there.
Thank you, Shane. We need somebody from the continent, our brothers in Africa, to say. Anybody? Lamin, you were quiet today. What do you think? Okay, Adebisi?
No, I was going to confirm to say what exactly, to share. Like, what do you need somebody to join to do what?
Just to comment on the cultural component. So we
okay. All right, good. Well, maybe before I go there, because while we were speaking, I was checking, some data about education in South Africa, to be precise. And I saw, through different websites, that South Africa still remain, the top 10 most educated country in Africa, and probably like top 3 in sub-Saharan Africa. I know, for instance, this was like a big news 2 years ago that Nigerians were like, the top most educated Blacks in the US. This was in 2020. If you look at the top most educated Black people in the US, they were Nigerians. So my thought is, maybe education is not really the problem. Maybe culture is the problem. And from the little things I know, maybe people that live in South Africa can, correct me here. I see maybe it's like an attitude problem, because these people have like the degree. I work for a multinational and I was recruited by South Africa. But I would say, the culture, it's, totally different. The way, people from the Western African are hungry is different from maybe the way people in South Africa, are hungry. So personally, I would not say maybe education is like, maybe it's a problem, but maybe it's not the biggest problem. Maybe culture is the biggest problem. Maybe the fact that, the Zulu and, the Black South Africans feel, the white South Africans or the people from Europe are stolen from us, then they need to give us some of these things automatically. And we don't really have to fight, about it. Maybe there needs to be like, a real cultural change. And this
I think if I can just maybe respond to that quickly, I think I agree with you on the cultural challenges here and there, and that's always going to be in place. But I think we need to take a step back from South Africa and from Nigeria and maybe a couple of these other more developed African countries. And if I look at a map and you look at illiteracy rates across the continent, there are patches across Africa that are so unbelievably illiterate still. And people don't finish school, or they start and they don't finish. So I think if we step out of our countries that we've mentioned, places like Kenya. I've been to Zambia, and I've bumped into people there that speak the most perfect English and vernacular I've ever heard. It's beautiful. It truly is a beautiful thing to hear. But there are other parts in Africa that are just truly illiterate and dark from that perspective. So I think in general, there's a lot of work to be done in Africa, but in some of these countries, you may have more cultural things to play at. Yeah.
I think also, it's difficult to talk about education and the role of education in full when we talk about the country where every 1 in 5 in South Africa live in extreme poverty.
Right.
That's what Shane referred to, talking about, according to Human Index, Development Index, that actually measures equality or inequality in the country and then ranks them. South Africa is 114 out of 189. So before that, before fighting poverty, before making people not worry that they have something to eat tomorrow, it's difficult to say that education
you know, kind of is not
Right.
really the proper route to that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, time flies in your company, really. I mean, we're already beyond the limit. I just want to thank you all, and particularly Alan, thank you very much. And Shane, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.
Glad you enjoyed it.
We know it was really insightful. I know so much more about South Africa, and of
Good.
course I want to visit it. It's just absolutely goes without saying. So thank you very, very much, everyone. Thanks for your participation. Please take the best care of yourselves and your loved ones, and we see you soon. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Welcome, Shane. See you then.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.